Just returning from a long business trip, I walked into the living room and froze in shock to find the display cabinet holding my late husband's lifelong heirloom collection completely empty. My daughter-in-law, casually sipping her tea, smirked. "Your old mother. Why keep them? Selling them helped us buy a luxury car and get my cosmetic procedures done." My son looked away. "You would leave them to me anyway," I chuckled softly. She snapped, "What's so funny?" I smiled. "Care to hear a secret?" Their faces turned pale instantly. "If you found your way here today, I am truly thankful. Drop a comment and tell me what part of the world are you joining me from, your city, your country. I want to know. That is what makes Silent Revenge with Auntie May feel like home. Please note certain elements of this story are fictional, added for depth and perspective. Names and settings are coincidental. The wisdom, however, is something I hope stays with you. The cab pulled away from the curb before I even reached the front steps. I had been traveling for 4 days, Washington, D.C., a legal conference on asset protection frameworks, 3 nights in a hotel room where the air conditioning ran too cold and the coffee was never strong enough. I was 65 years old. I had spent 31 years on the federal bench, and the only thing I wanted was to walk through my own front door, set my luggage down in the hallway, and stand in the room where Arthur's collection lived. I called it his collection even now, 4 years after we buried him. He would have corrected me. "Ours," he would have said, pressing 2 fingers against my wrist, the way he always did when he wanted me to pay attention. "Everything I built for both of us. Evelyn." The hallway smelled of lemon polish and old wood exactly as it always had. I set my bag down, rolled my shoulders back, walked toward the east wing. The display room door was open. I stepped inside and my chest tightened so sharply that I pressed one hand flat against the doorframe to steady myself. The cabinet, the long glass-fronted cabinet that Arthur had commissioned from a craftsman in Vermont, the one with the brushed brass locks and the velvet-lined shelves, was empty. Every shelf, every bracket, every small cedar stand where a watch or a brooch or a pendant had rested for years. Gone. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. My eyes moved from shelf to shelf the way they used to move across a courtroom, methodical counting, confirming what I already knew. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no displaced furniture. Whoever had done this had used a key. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I already knew who it was. Nadia Cruz, my administrative assistant at Montgomery Heritage Asset LLC, had called twice while I was still at Reagan National. I had sent her a voicemail both times, telling myself it could wait until I was home. I understood now why her voice had cracked on the second message. I did not panic. Panic had never served me in 31 years on the bench, and it would not serve me now. Instead, I walked to Arthur's old study at the end of the hall, sat down behind his desk, and opened the bottom drawer. His handwriting looked back at me from a single folded page, the letter he had written 14 months before he died, when the doctors had started using words like trajectory and timeline in the same breath. I had read it so many times that I no longer needed to unfold it fully, but I read it again anyway because some things deserve to be read in full every single time. Evelyn. It began the way every letter he ever wrote to me began, as though my name alone was the whole introduction. The collection is the most visible thing I am leaving behind. That makes it the most vulnerable. People who would never dream of taking money from a grieving widow will find ways to justify taking objects. They will tell themselves it is sentimental, that it is fair, that you have enough. I am asking you to do something that will feel overly cautious and maybe even a little cold. Have a replica made. Put the real pieces somewhere only you can reach. Register everything under the LLC, not your personal name. Do this for me. Do this before someone else makes the decision for you. He had written that in October. He was gone by the following February. I had done exactly what he asked. 6 months ago, I had commissioned a master craftsman, a conservator who worked with the Field Museum, to produce a complete replica of the Crimson Legacy. The reproduction was extraordinary. hand-finished, period-accurate, built to withstand casual inspection by anyone who was not running a spectrographic analysis. I had placed it in the cabinet, changed absolutely nothing about the room's appearance, and transferred the originals into a private vault at Northern Trust Bank on LaSalle Street. Arthur had known. He had known the way he always knew, not with certainty about who or when, but with the quiet, unhurried certainty of a man who had watched human nature operate for 7 decades. My throat tightened. I pressed my lips together until the sensation passed. Then I opened the center drawer and took out the small brass key that opened the safety deposit box. I set it on the desk beside Arthur's letter. I looked at both of them for a moment. The key and the letter, the preparation and the love behind it, and something shifted in my chest that was not grief and was not anger. It was readiness. I picked up my phone and called Dr. Patricia Hale. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting my call. "Patricia," I said, "the collection is gone from the house. I need the LLC file, Raymond's direct line, and the insurance endorsement we added in March." "I already pulled them," she said. "Raymond has been standing by since Nadia called me this afternoon. How are you holding up?" I looked at the empty key hook beside Arthur's desk, the hook where Derek had kept a spare house key since he was 19 years old. "I am holding up the way I always hold up," I said, thoroughly. I ended the call, sat in Arthur's chair for 1 more minute, let myself feel the weight of the room, the smell of his books, the particular quality of the late afternoon light through the west window that he had loved and I had always taken for granted. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, and picked up the brass key from the desk. The collection was safe. The replica was gone. And whoever had taken it had no idea what they had actually walked out of this house carrying. For the first time since I'd come through the front door, I felt the corners of my mouth move. I had slipped the note under Derek's door at 11 the previous night while the house was quiet. 4 words written in the same hand I had used to sign 31 years of federal rulings. Living room, 8 a.m. No explanation. No softening. Derek had grown up in this house. He knew what it meant when I wrote without punctuation at the end. By 7:55, Dr. Patricia Hale was already seated in the wingback chair beside the fireplace, her laptop open, a manila folder thick enough to serve as a doorstop resting across her knees. Patricia had been my legal partner for 19 years. She had the kind of stillness that courtrooms produce in people, the ability to sit in a charged room and give nothing away with her face or her hands. I stood at the window overlooking the front garden and watched the street below. At 8:02, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Derek's footsteps. I had known that particular rhythm since he was 4 years old, that slightly heavy landing on the left foot from an old soccer injury he had never properly rehabilitated. He came through the doorway with his shoulders squared and his chin lifted, wearing the expression he always wore when he was performing confidence he did not feel. Chloe was 2 steps behind him. Her dark hair freshly styled her lip. He came through the doorway with his shoulders squared and his chin lifted, wearing the expression he always wore when he was performing confidence he did not feel. Chloe was 2 steps behind him, her dark hair freshly styled, her lips pressed together in that tight, controlled smile she used when she was calculating rather than feeling. "Mom." Derek spread his hands open at his sides, a gesture meant to signal openness. "What's going on? You've got Patricia here like this is a deposition." "Sit down, Derek," I said without turning from the window. "I'd rather stand." "I didn't ask what you'd prefer." I turned then. "Sit down." His jaw tightened, but he sat. Chloe took the chair beside him, crossing her ankles and folding her hands in her lap, like a woman who had practiced looking composed in difficult rooms. I pulled the chair across from them and sat facing them both. That was when Victoria Harrison walked through the front door without knocking. She swept into the living room with the particular energy of a woman who had decided that being the mother of someone's wife entitled her to the same access as a household member. She was wearing a cream blazer and carrying a bag, a large structured bag, in a deep cognac color that I recognized immediately. It had appeared on her arm exactly 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago to the day. "Oh, is this a family meeting?" She settled herself onto the sofa without being invited. "Wonderful. I love that you all communicate so openly." I looked at the bag. Then I looked at Chloe. Chloe's eyes dropped to the floor. I filed that away and turned back to Derek. "The Crimson Legacy is gone," I said. Derek blinked. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean the cabinet is empty. I mean that when I came home from Washington yesterday, every piece your father spent 30 years collecting had been removed from this house." I paused. "I mean that Raymond Holt has been working for the past 2 weeks, and Patricia has a folder on her lap that I'd like you to look at." Derek's face did something complicated, a rapid sequence of expressions that moved from surprise to calculation to something that was almost relief before he caught himself and pulled his features back into concern. Chloe placed one hand on his knee, a steadying gesture or a warning. "Mom, that's terrible," Derek said. "Have you called the police? It could be a break-in, it could be—" "There was no break-in." I kept my voice level. The door was unlocked, the alarm was disarmed, the cabinet was opened with a key. I looked at him steadily. "You have had a key to this house since you were 19 years old." The color left his face so quickly that I thought for a moment he might be sick. Patricia opened the folder without being asked and placed 3 documents on the coffee table between us. The first was a printed email chain, Derek's personal address at the top, an unfamiliar Nevada address below it, a back and forth that spanned 11 days. The second was an invoice from a specialty transport company in Salt Lake City. The third was a wire transfer record showing $300,000 moving from a Nevada account to a joint account held in Derek's name and Chloe's name the Tuesday before last. Derek stared at the documents. His left hand resting on his knee had begun to tremble. "Those could be," Chloe started. "They are what they appear to be," Patricia said, and her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "We have the complete chain, the emails, the transport coordination, the payment record, and the authorization letter that was submitted to the buyer on your behalf." "What authorization letter?" Derek's voice cracked on the last word. I leaned forward slightly. "The one signed in my name, Derek. The one that claimed I had authorized you to negotiate and execute the sale on behalf of Montgomery Heritage Asset, LLC." I let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. That letter was sent by email. Do you understand what that means under federal law? He shook his head, but his eyes told me he was beginning to understand. "It means wire fraud," I said. 18 United States Code Section 1343, a federal charge, not a state one. I watched his throat move as he swallowed. "And because the Crimson Legacy was transported from Illinois to Nevada across state lines, we are also looking at 18 United States Code, Section 2314, interstate transportation of stolen property." "Stolen?" Chloe's voice rose sharply. "That is your son. You cannot sit there and call your own son I can describe the legal category of an action without it being a personal judgment," I said, turning to look at her directly for the first time. "What I cannot do is pretend the law does not apply to people I love." Victoria shifted on the sofa, her cognac bag pressed close against her side. "Surely this is something we can resolve privately," she said, her voice bright with the particular brightness of someone who is frightened and hiding it behind social confidence. "Family matters don't need to involve. The Crimson Legacy does not belong to me personally, Victoria." I turned to face her. "It belongs to Montgomery Heritage Asset, LLC, a federally registered limited liability company of which I am the sole managing member. Derek is not a member of that LLC. He has no legal authority over its assets. None." I folded my hands in my lap. This stopped being a family matter the moment that collection crossed the Illinois state line. Derek's chair scraped back hard against the hardwood floor as he lurched to his feet. His hands gripped the back of the chair so tightly that his knuckles went white, and when he spoke, his voice had the rough, breaking quality of a man trying to hold something together that was already in pieces. "Mom, please." The word came out ragged. "Please just tell me what you want me to do. Tell me how to fix this. Tell me there is a way to fix this." I looked at my son. At the boy who had fallen asleep in my courtroom on late nights, curled in the big leather chair in the corner with his shoes still on. At the man who had somewhere at some point made a decision I could not make for him and could not take back for him. "Patricia," I said quietly, "will you explain to Derek what his options are?" Patricia had been speaking for 11 minutes when Chloe decided she had heard enough. "Stop." Chloe's voice cut across the room like a hand slapping a table. She was on her feet before any of us registered that she had moved her chair, scraping back hard, her chest rising and falling with the rapid, shallow breathing of someone who had decided that offense was the only remaining defense. "Just stop. All of this, the folder, the legal citations, the federal this and the interstate, that none of it changes what has already happened." She spread her hands wide, her voice climbing with the particular pitch of someone performing certainty they do not feel. "The money has been transferred. The collection has been sold. The transaction is complete. You cannot undo a completed transaction, Evelyn. Even you cannot do that." Victoria nodded vigorously from the sofa. "Chloe is right. These things happen in families. The practical reality is that the collection is gone and the money is it's been allocated. Pursuing this legally would only hurt everyone, including you." Derek said nothing. He was still standing behind his chair with both hands gripping the back of it, staring at the documents on the coffee table, as though they might rearrange themselves into a better outcome if he looked long enough. His face had the gray, sunken quality of a man who had not slept and did not expect to sleep again for some time. I let Chloe finish. I let Victoria finish. I waited until the room had contracted around their certainty, and they had both settled back into the comfortable posture of people who believed they had just won an argument. Then I nodded at Patricia. She turned her laptop to face the room. The photograph on the screen was taken 3 weeks ago inside the vault at Northern Trust Bank on LaSalle Street. I recognized the lighting, the particular flat white light of a bank's interior storage facility. And there, arranged on the velvet-lined trays, exactly as Arthur had always kept them, was the Crimson Legacy. Every piece, the Patek Philippe Perpetual Calendar from 1958, the Cartier brooch with the Burmese rubies that Arthur's mother had brought from Charleston, the Vacheron Constantin pocket watch with the inscription on the back that I had written myself on our 20th anniversary in the jeweler's shop on Michigan Avenue. Every single piece whole and untouched exactly where I had placed them. Chloe's breath left her body in one sharp, audible rush. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. Derek's grip on the chair tightened until I could hear the wood creak under the pressure of his fingers. "What is that?" Chloe whispered. It was not a question. "That is the Crimson Legacy," I said. "The original collection, currently secured in a private vault at Northern Trust, where it has been for the past 6 months. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It had texture thick and suffocating, and full of the sound of 3 people doing rapid, desperate arithmetic in their heads." "Then what did we—" Derek started. "You sold a replica," I said. "A reproduction commissioned from a conservator at the Field Museum, a man who has spent 40 years working on period-accurate artifact reconstruction. Every surface finish, every patina, every weight and dimension matched to within a tolerance that would pass a standard visual inspection and a basic materials assessment." I stood up and walked to the window because I needed to put some distance between myself and the expression on my son's face. "Arthur asked me to do this," I said, keeping my voice steady, keeping it professional, keeping it everything it needed to be. "In the last year of his life, he asked me to protect the collection. He knew not specifically not with names, but he knew that visible wealth in a grieving household creates appetites. He wanted the real pieces somewhere safe and something convincing in their place. He was a careful man. He had always been a careful man." I turned back to face them. The conservator built the replica to pass a surface inspection and a basic handheld assessment. I continued. It would not, however, survive a metallurgical analysis, the kind that a sophisticated buyer runs when they want to verify authenticity before registering an acquisition. I watched Chloe's face as the implication settled into her. The kind of analysis that typically takes between 5 and 7 business days in a specialty lab. Victoria made a sound that was not quite a word. Her hands pressed flat against her knees, and the knuckles of her right hand had gone the same white as Derek's. "The man you sold it to," I said quietly. "He would have sent samples out within 48 hours of taking possession. He would have results by now or very close to it." Chloe's face had gone the color of old candle wax. "You planned this," she said, and her voice had dropped from its performance register into something rawer and more truthful. "You knew. You set this up before any of this even happened." "Arthur set it up," I said. "I honored his instructions." "That is the same thing." "No." I looked at her directly. "It is not. Arthur loved this family enough to protect it from itself. I am simply the person he trusted to carry that out." Derek released the chair and sank down into it, rather than sat. His elbows went to his knees and his face went into his hands, and the sound that came out of him was not crying exactly. It was the sound of a man trying very hard not to cry and losing that effort 1 degree at a time. $300,000, he said, muffled behind his palms. We already... "I know what you spent it on," I said. "Raymond's report is quite thorough." Chloe spun toward me. "You had us investigated before any of this." "I had the transaction investigated," I said. "There is a difference." Victoria stood up abruptly from the sofa, the cognac bag clutched against her chest with both arms, her voice climbing back toward indignation, as though indignation were something she could still afford. "This is outrageous. You cannot surveil your own family." Derek's phone buzzed on the coffee table. Once, twice, 3 times in quick succession. All of us looked at it. The screen faced upward. The number displayed was not saved in his contacts. The area code was 702, Las Vegas. Derek's hands came away from his face. He stared at the phone with the expression of a man watching something he had been dreading come through the door. His skin had gone from gray to a color I did not have a name for. His chest rose once sharply, and when he exhaled, his breath shook. "Derek?" I said. He picked up the phone with fingers that trembled so badly he nearly dropped it twice. Derek answered on the 4th ring. His thumb hit the speaker button before I could ask him to, which told me that some part of him, the part that had grown up watching me conduct proceedings, understood that whatever was about to happen needed witnesses. "Mr. Montgomery." The voice that came through the speaker was unhurried and pleasant in the way that certain very dangerous things are pleasant smooth on the surface with considerable weight underneath. "My name is Garrick Thorne. I believe you know why I'm calling." Derek's throat worked. "Mr. Thorne, I sent samples to an independent metallurgical lab in Scottsdale 8 days ago," Garrick said without raising his voice, without any change in register whatsoever. "I received the full analysis this morning. The alloys in 3 of the watch cases do not match the documented compositions for the manufacturers listed in the provenance paperwork. The gold content in the brooch setting is consistent with modern electroplating, not period casting." A brief pause. "Mr. Montgomery, I have been in this business for 22 years. I have handled estates liquidations and private collections from here to Geneva. I know what a reproduction looks like when I am holding a spectrometer report." Chloe pressed both hands flat against her mouth. Her eyes had gone very wide and very bright, the way eyes go when the body is deciding between fight and flight and has not yet committed to either. "Mr. Thorne." Derek started again, his voice climbing toward something that wanted to be an explanation. There must be some kind of misunderstanding because the collection was represented to me as, "I am going to stop you there," Garrick said, and the pleasantness in his voice acquired a faint, deliberate edge, like a letter opener that has been sharpened past its original purpose. "I paid $300,000. I paid it in good faith, based on documentation that included a signed authorization letter from the managing member of Montgomery Heritage Asset LLC. That letter has since been flagged as potentially fraudulent by my attorney. The title transfer application I submitted to the Nevada Secretary of State has been placed on administrative hold." Another pause, longer this time. "I want my money returned, all of it, within 72 hours. Derek turned to look at me with the expression of a drowning man spotting a boat on the horizon. His eyes were red at the rims. His lower lip had developed a tremor he was doing his best to suppress. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a breath. "Mom, please. Tell me there is something we can do. Tell me." "Let Patricia speak," I said. Patricia set her folder on the coffee table and folded her hands over it with the calm of someone who had delivered bad news so many times that she had learned to make it merciful by making it clear. "Mr. Thorne's attorney has already been in contact with our office," she said. "Raymond Holt traced the disposition of the $300,000 over the past 2 weeks. I have the full breakdown." She opened the folder and read without inflection. $180,000 was wired directly to the Beverly Hills Aesthetic Institute on Roxbury Drive on the day after the funds cleared. $45,000 was transferred to an account in Chloe Harrison Montgomery's name, designated for the purchase of a luxury handbag. $38,000 in additional retail and travel purchases across 4 states over the following 9 days. $25,000 withdrawn in cash by Victoria Harrison at a branch in Naperville. Derek Montgomery retained approximately $12,000 for what appear to be logistics and travel expenses. Patricia closed the folder. "Current balance across all associated accounts," she said, "is approximately $4,200. The room absorbed that number, the way a room absorbs a thunderclap, with a moment of complete full-body stillness before every person in it reacted at once. Victoria made a sound that began as a word and dissolved into something shapeless and high-pitched. She lurched to her feet and spun toward Chloe, jabbing one finger at her with a force that made the cognac bag slip from her shoulder and swing against her hip. "You told me the money was cleared. You told me it was legitimate. You said—" "I said what I needed to say to get things done." Chloe snapped back, and her voice had shed every layer of performance and arrived somewhere furious and cornered. "You were not exactly asking hard questions when you were cashing out in Naperville, Victoria. That is not the same. It is exactly the same. Stop." Derek's voice came out raw and cracked, louder than I had heard it since he was a teenager, and both women went quiet because the rawness of it was startling in its honesty. He turned to me, and his face had gone so far past composure that it had arrived somewhere almost peaceful, the face of a person who has nothing left to protect. "Mom, the money is gone. Garrick wants it back by Friday." He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead so hard his skin went red beneath it. "We cannot pay him. There is nothing left to pay him with." I looked at my son for a long moment, at the boy who had once brought me wildflowers from the yard with dirt still on their stems, and presented them as though they were the finest arrangement on earth. At the man sitting across from me now with 72 hours on a clock he did not know how to stop. And then, because I was his mother and I had loved him before he was capable of disappointing me, I let myself feel it, the tightening in my chest, the specific quiet grief of watching someone you raised make choices that required this room, this conversation, this outcome. I felt it fully for exactly 10 seconds. Then I set it aside. "Patricia," I said, "please explain to Derek and Chloe the timeline for a federal investigation of this nature, and then explain what happens to people who attempt to obstruct one." Derek's head snapped up. "Obstruct Mom, I am not going to—" "I know," I said quietly. "I know you are not. That is why Patricia is going to explain it clearly so that you understand exactly what cooperating looks like and why it is the only option that ends in any version of a livable future for you. I stood up. My knees ached the way they always did when I had been sitting in tension for too long. The FBI does not move quickly on financial crimes. They move carefully. You have time to make choices, Derek. But that window closes. Patricia will tell you exactly how quickly. I walked to the doorway and turned back one final time. The deadline from Mr. Thorne is a civil matter, I added. Patricia's office is already communicating with his attorney. We will manage that timeline. I looked at Derek steadily. What I cannot manage for you is the federal piece. That one you will have to face yourself. I left them there. Derek with his face in his hands again, Chloe gripping the arm of her chair with white-knuckled fingers, Victoria pacing the length of the sofa, muttering something I chose not to hear, and Patricia sitting at the center of it all with the patient, unflinching composure of a woman who had seen worse and expected she would see worse again. I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and stood at the counter with both hands flat on the cold marble, pressing down until I could feel my pulse in my palms. Outside the window, a pair of starlings were fighting over something small on the back lawn. I watched them until the kettle boiled. I called Victoria on a Tuesday morning 3 days after the living room. My voice was warm. My voice was the voice I used when I wanted someone to walk through a door without checking what was on the other side of it. Victoria. I said, I've been thinking. We got off to a terrible start last week and I take some responsibility for that. The atmosphere was charged. I'd love to have lunch Thursday. Just the two of us at the club. Bring that beautiful bag of yours. I have a friend I'd like you to meet. She works in luxury goods acquisitions. I think you two would have a wonderful conversation. There was a pause on the line. I could hear Victoria recalibrating, weighing the invitation against what had happened in my living room, deciding whether this was an olive branch or a trap, and ultimately landing, as I suspected she would, on the conclusion that a woman of her social ambitions could not afford to turn down lunch at the Lakeside Club. That sounds lovely, she said with the brightness of someone who had decided to be delighted. I'll wear the Hermes. Perfect, I said. I ended the call and looked across my kitchen table at Peggy Collins, who was on her third cup of coffee and watching me with the expression she reserved for moments she found particularly satisfying. Peggy had been my neighbor for 11 years. She was 68 years old. She had raised 4 children, buried 1 husband, and survived a home renovation that had taken 14 months longer than projected, which she maintained was the hardest thing she had ever done. She was also the sharpest person I knew who had never sat on a bench, and she had a gift for reading a room that most lawyers I'd known would have paid good money for. You are a deeply unsettling woman, she said, refilling her own cup without being asked. I mean that with enormous affection. I know you do, I said. Thursday, can you make it? Try to stop me. She set the coffee pot down and tilted her head. Who's your authentication person? Martin Reeves. He spent 12 years at Christie's before he opened his own consultancy. He can identify a replica Birkin from across a dinner table. Peggy pressed her lips together in a line that was fighting very hard not to become a smile. Evelyn Montgomery, she said, you have been planning this for 3 days. I have been planning this for longer than that, I said. The Lakeside Club occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a building on Michigan Avenue that had been there since 1922. The dining room had high ceilings, white tablecloths, and windows that looked out over the lake on clear days with the particular expansiveness that made people feel, without quite knowing why, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. I arrived 15 minutes early. Martin Reeves was already seated, a lean, precise man in his mid-50s, with the careful hands of someone accustomed to handling things of value, wearing a jacket that was good but not showy, which was exactly right. Peggy arrived 4 minutes later, unwound a scarf the color of autumn leaves, and settled into her chair with the comfortable authority of a woman who had eaten at this table many times before. Ground rules, Peggy said, picking up the menu. I'm not allowed to laugh. Correct, I said. And if I feel a laugh coming, I should... Drink your water. Understood. She opened the menu. I'm ordering the salmon. Victoria arrived at 12:15, 11 minutes late, which was her custom. She came through the dining room entrance with the particular walk of a woman who believes she is being observed and has decided to reward that. Observation, shoulders back, chin lifted, the cognac bag swinging from the crook of her left arm with the easy confidence of an accessory that expects to be admired. She kissed me on both cheeks, which she had never done before in 11 years of knowing each other, and settled into her chair with an expansive smile that took in Peggy, and distributed warmth to both of them with the practiced generosity of a woman who understood that charm was a form of currency. "What a lovely table," she said, "and what a view. Martin was just telling us about a Patek Philippe he authenticated last month." I said, "Victoria, Martin Reeves. He's been in luxury goods authentication for over 20 years. Martin extended his hand with a pleasant smile. "The bag is beautiful," he said, nodding toward the cognac piece on the table beside Victoria's chair. "May I ask, is that the 35 or the 40? Victoria's chest swelled with the particular pleasure of a woman asked about something she is proud of. "The 30, she said, lifting the bag and setting it on the table between them with the reverence of a reliquary. "Cognac Togo. Derek and Chloe gave it to me as a gift. I've been absolutely over the moon about it." Martin lifted the bag with both hands the way a person lifts something they respect. He turned it slowly, examined the stitching along the top handle, ran his thumb along the interior edge of the flap. He looked at the hardware, the palladium finish on the clasp, and then he tilted the bag very slightly and looked at the blind stamp inside the gusset. His expression did not change. He set the bag down on the table with the same care with which he had lifted it. "It's a very well-made piece," he said. "The leather surface treatment is excellent. The stitching count is close 16 per inch on the main panels, which is correct." He folded his hands. "However, the blind stamp typeface is inconsistent with the current Hermès Paris production standard. The hardware finish is rhodium plating rather than palladium, the weight is slightly off, and it doesn't have the resistance to a thumb press that you'd expect from palladium. And the interior stitching on the gusset lining is machine finished rather than hand sewn." He looked at Victoria with the kind, direct eyes of a man delivering a medical diagnosis he would rather not give. "This is a high-quality reproduction, Victoria, a very good one, but it isn't an authentic Hermès Birkin." Victoria's face did not move for approximately 3 full seconds. Then it moved all at once. "I beg your pardon," she said, and the sentence came out at a volume that was not appropriate for the 14th floor of the Lakeside Club. The couple at the next table looked over. A server near the window paused mid-pour. Peggy reached for her water glass. "This is not possible." Victoria continued, her voice climbing another register, her hand gripping the edge of the table so hard her rings pressed white marks into her fingers. "I was told, Chloe told me, she said it was $45,000. She stopped. Her eyes went very wide, and then, with the particular horror of a woman who has just understood something she cannot ununderstand, she pulled her phone from her purse and called her daughter. "You pick up right now," she said when Chloe answered. "You pick up and you tell me exactly what you paid for this bag." Her voice cracked on the last word, the social composure finally splitting down the middle under the pressure of what she now knew, because I am sitting here with an authentication expert who is telling me that what you gave me is a $300 replica, and I want to know where the other $44,700 went, Chloe. I want to know right now. I lifted my water glass and took a slow, measured sip. Across the table, Peggy set her own glass down, pressed her lips together once, and looked at me with eyes that were bright with the effort of maintaining composure. "It gets better," I said quietly. Peggy picked up the menu. "I'm ordering dessert," she said. "I don't care that we haven't had the entree yet." The morning after the lunch at the club, Chloe posted a new story to her Instagram. I know this because Raymond Holt included a screenshot in his 7 a.m. update, along with a note in his characteristically sparse style. "Subject attempting image rehabilitation. Dr. Marsh has been informed. Anticipate activity within 24 hours. The story showed Chloe seated at a window table somewhere with good light and an artfully positioned latte, heavy filter. The caption read, "Unbothered, thriving, healing. Some people can't stand to see you grow." There was a small sun emoji at the end, which I noted and set aside because what interested me was not the caption but the photograph itself, her jawline. 3 weeks of post-surgical swelling had subsided enough that the asymmetry was now clearly visible, the left side of her jaw sitting approximately 4 millimeters lower than the right, the chin projection slightly off-center in a way that no filter could fully correct. I was not a medical professional, but I had been married to a man who collected precision instruments for 30 years, and I understood what calibration failure looked like. I set Raymond's report on my desk and picked up my coffee. At 11:47 that morning, Dr. Elliot Marsh posted a video to his YouTube channel. Dr. Marsh was 45 years old, board certified by the American Board of Plastic Surgery, and maintained a practice on Camden Drive in Beverly Hills that had been reviewed in 3 separate medical publications in the past 4 years. He was not Chloe's doctor. He had never met Chloe. He had no access to her medical records, her surgical history, or any protected health information of any kind. What he did have was an Instagram account, a YouTube channel with 240,000 subscribers, and a long-standing practice of posting educational analyses of publicly available photographs to help patients understand what to look for and what to avoid when considering elective procedures. The video was titled, "Breaking Down a Textbook Case of Botched Jawline Contouring, What Went Wrong and Why." He did not use Chloe's name. He did not tag her account. He used 3 photographs, all of them pulled directly from her public Instagram feed, where they had been posted without privacy restrictions by Chloe herself, which meant they carried no HIPAA protection whatsoever, because HIPAA applies to protected health information exchanged within a provider relationship, not to photographs that a private individual chooses to make available to the general public. Dr. Marsh walked through each image with the calm, methodical precision of a surgeon who had performed this type of educational content many times before. He explained the anatomical landmarks he was looking for. He described the ideal proportions for jawline contouring relative to the Frankfurt horizontal plane. He used a digital overlay to illustrate the degree of asymmetry visible in the post-surgical photographs. He was thorough. He was specific. He was in every way that mattered legally and professionally, entirely within his rights. By 2 in the afternoon, the comments on Chloe's most recent post had exceeded 400. Raymond forwarded me a summary at 3:15. 3 of her brand partnerships had sent formal termination notices. Within the same hour, a skincare company based in Scottsdale, a supplement brand out of Austin, and a clothing boutique in Nashville that had been paying her a monthly retainer for 6 months. A 4th brand had gone quiet in a way that suggested their legal team was drafting something. I was reading Raymond's summary at my desk when I heard it through the wall. Chloe's voice from the guest room at the end of the hall, high and ragged, and nothing like the carefully modulated tone she used when she knew she was being observed. She was on the phone and she was not keeping her volume down, and I heard her say Dr. Marsh's name twice and then say my name once in a way that made it clear she had drawn a straight line between the two. Then I heard Derek's voice lower, trying to soothe, trying to absorb, and Chloe's voice rising above his, the way a wave rises above something fixed and solid and simply goes over it. "You need to fix this," she said loudly enough that the words came through the wall without any ambiguity. "Call her. Call your mother and tell her to make it stop. She did this. She had to have done this. This does not just happen." Derek said something I couldn't make out. "I don't care," Chloe said. "I do not care what you think she can or cannot do. I am losing everything. Do you understand that everything I have built, my following, my partnerships, my brand, it is collapsing while I am sitting in your mother's guest room because we have nowhere else to go. So you will call her. You will call her right now, and you will fix this." A door slammed hard enough to rattle the frame. Then Derek's footsteps in the hallway. Then a knock on my study door, tentative, the knock of a man who is not sure he wants the door to open. "Come in," I said. He looked the way people look when they have been carrying something very heavy for too long and have arrived at the moment where they simply have to set it down wherever they are standing, because they cannot take another step. His eyes were swollen at the corners. His shirt was untucked on one side in a way that suggested he had dressed in a hurry and not looked in a mirror since. "Did you do this?" he asked. His voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of a man asking a question he already knew the answer to and needed to hear confirmed so he could stop wondering. I set Raymond's report face down on the desk. "Dr. Marsh analyzed photographs that Chloe posted publicly to her own Instagram account," I said. Photographs she chose to share with hundreds of thousands of people. He's a board-certified surgeon producing educational content. He did not use her name. He did not access her medical records. He did not violate a single provision of HIPAA or any other law. I folded my hands on the desk. I did not make Chloe post those photographs, Derek. I did not make her undergo the surgery, and I did not pay for it with money that belonged to a federally registered LLC. Derek pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. His eyes had gone glassy in the way that precedes tears in people who have been taught that crying is something to be managed rather than felt. He stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling unevenly, his free hand gripping the door frame with fingers that had gone white at the tips. "What is left?" he said finally, his voice muffled behind his hand. "Mom, what is actually left? The money is gone. Chloe's brand is gone. Garrick is—" He stopped, pressed harder. "What is left for us?" I looked at my son, at the swollen eyes and the untucked shirt and the white-knuckled grip on my door frame, at the specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from being wronged, but from having done wrong and being required to live inside the consequences of it. "Patricia received the formal asset recovery documentation this afternoon," I said quietly. "The LLC holds title to the Mercedes, the club memberships, and the lease on your apartment." I watched his face. "The recovery process begins tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Derek's hand dropped from his mouth. The color left his face in a single clean wave, the way water recedes from a shore. 6 a.m., he repeated. His voice was barely above a breath. 6 a.m., I said, and I meant every syllable of it. He stood in my doorway for another moment. Then he turned and walked back down the hall, and I listened to his footsteps until they stopped outside the guest room door, and I heard Chloe's voice rise again before he had even finished knocking. I picked up Raymond's report, turned it face up, and finished reading. "The tow truck arrived at 6:03. I know the exact time because I was already awake, already dressed, already at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I stood there watching the street below. I had not slept past 4:30. In 31 years on the federal bench, I had never been able to sleep the night before a significant proceeding, and what was happening this morning qualified. The truck pulled up in front of the building where Derek and Chloe had been renting since the previous week, when Patricia had notified them of the 72-hour vacate requirement on the apartment. The driver climbed out, checked his paperwork against the license plate of the black Mercedes in the reserved spot, and began the process of attachment with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this particular task more times than he could count. Patricia was already on the sidewalk when the truck arrived. I had asked her to be present, not because the process required it, but because I wanted a witness who could not be rattled, and Patricia Hale had never been rattled by anything in the 19 years I had known her. She stood beside the building entrance with her folder under one arm and her phone in her hand, documenting everything with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who understood that the value of evidence lay entirely in its completeness. Chloe came out of the building at 6:11. She was still in her robe, a cream silk thing that had been purchased, according to Raymond's accounting, from a boutique in the Magnificent Mile 3 weeks ago with funds from the disputed transfer. Her hair was loose, and her face was unguarded in the way that faces are when a person has been pulled from sleep by something they were not prepared for. She stopped on the front steps and stared at the truck, and then at the Mercedes being lifted from the ground, and then at Patricia, standing on the sidewalk with her folder. "What is this?" The words came out flat and airless, the way words come out when the body has not yet caught up with what the eyes are seeing. "Good morning, Chloe," Patricia said. "The Mercedes is registered as an asset of Montgomery Heritage Asset LLC under the company's operating agreement. As sole managing member, Evelyn Montgomery has authorized its recovery. I have the documentation if you'd like to review it." Chloe's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, then fury, then something that cracked through the fury like a fault line opening and exposed something rawer and more frightened underneath. She gripped the railing of the front steps with both hands and leaned forward and said at a volume that carried clearly down the empty morning street, "You cannot do this. You cannot just take things. This is our car. This is our life." "The operating agreement is dated 4 years ago," Patricia said with the measured patience of a woman who had made this exact argument in rooms considerably more contentious than a sidewalk at 6 in the morning. "The vehicle registration lists Montgomery Heritage Asset LLC as the titled owner. Your name does not appear on the title. Derek's name does not appear on the title." She tilted her head slightly. "The club memberships will be formally terminated at 9 a.m. when the office is open. The lease termination on this unit was executed last Tuesday. You have until Friday." Chloe made a sound that was not a word, a high compressed sound that came from somewhere behind her sternum and escaped before she could stop it. She pressed one hand flat against her mouth and her eyes went bright and wet, and for a moment she looked very young. Not the curated, filtered version of young she presented to her camera, but actually young, actually frightened, actually standing on a sidewalk in a silk robe, watching her life get loaded onto a flatbed. Derek appeared in the doorway behind her. He was dressed, but barely jeans and a sweater shoes without socks, the look of a man who had pulled on whatever was closest rather than whatever was right. He took in the truck, the Mercedes rising from the ground, Patricia on the sidewalk, and Chloe gripping the railing, and something in his face simply stopped, the way a clock stops when its battery runs out, not dramatically, just a cessation. He put his hand on Chloe's shoulder. She shrugged it off without looking at him. Across the street, standing at the corner with a coffee cup in her hand and her coat buttoned against the November cold, was Victoria. She had been there, Raymond later told me, since 5:50. She had not crossed the street. She had not spoken to anyone. She simply stood and watched, and at some point, while the Mercedes was being secured to the truck, she turned and walked away down the sidewalk without looking back. She was not carrying the cognac bag. I did not see any of this in person. I was standing at my kitchen window 4 blocks away, watching the starlings on the back lawn again, because some things you arrange and then you do not need to witness. The arranging is enough. The follow-through belongs to Patricia. My phone rang at 6:47. Derek, not a text. An actual call which told me something. I answered it. "She's gone," he said. No greeting. His voice had the quality of something wrung out completely. Not calm, but emptied of everything that had been in it before. Victoria left. Chloe went back inside. I'm standing on the sidewalk. A pause, and I heard the sound of a November morning in the background, a bus somewhere, a dog, the ordinary noise of a city going about its business while his life stood still. "I don't know what to do with myself right now, Mom. I genuinely don't know." "That's all right," I said. "You don't have to know right now." He breathed, uneven. The kind of breathing that happens when a person is fighting to keep something contained and not entirely winning. "Did you love me?" he asked. The question came out quietly, without accusation, without anger, just the raw, direct simplicity of a man who needed an answer more than he needed to protect himself from it. "When I was growing up. Before all of this. Did you actually love me, or was I always just a proceeding, a case, something to be managed?" My hand tightened on the phone. Outside my kitchen window, the starlings had gone. The lawn was empty and gray in the early light, and the oak tree at the far end had lost the last of its leaves, and the yard had the particular quiet of a place that is resting rather than empty. I stood there with my hand tight around the phone and felt the tightening move up through my chest and into my throat, and I let it. I did not set it aside this time. I let it stay. "I loved you before you had a name," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected it to. I loved the boy who used to fall asleep in my courtroom when I worked late, curled up in the big leather chair with his shoes still on and his mouth open. I loved the 12-year-old who cried at the end of every baseball season because he didn't want summer to be over. I stopped. Pressed my lips together once. "I still love him? I have been looking for him in the man you've become for a long time, Derek. I haven't been able to find him." The silence on the line was the kind that has weight. "Chloe says if I leave her," Derek said, "she'll tell everyone I planned the whole thing, that I was the one who found Garrick, that I forged the documents myself." His voice dropped to something barely above a breath. "I don't have the energy to fight her mom. I don't have anything left." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Your father left something for your birthday," I said. "Be at the house Saturday evening. Come alone." Another pause. "What did he leave?" "Come alone," I said. Saturday evening. I ended the call, set the phone down on the kitchen counter, pressed both hands flat against the cold marble, and stood there feeling my pulse in my palms, the way I had the morning after the living room, the morning after I had first understood what I was going to have to do and how completely I was going to have to do it. The lawn outside was still empty. The oak tree stood at the end of it, bare and patient, the way old things stand when they have survived enough seasons to know that bare is not the same as finished. What Evelyn did next in front of everyone Derek had ever respected is something I have been building toward this entire story. Before I take you there, type "show me" in the comments so I know you are still with me. Your presence here matters deeply. A note before we continue: parts of this story include fictional elements added for impact and perspective. You are always free to step away if that is not what you came here for. For those staying, take a breath. You will need it. I had not hosted a gathering in this house since Arthur's memorial service 4 years ago. Tonight was different. Tonight had a purpose. By 7:15, 15 people were seated in the living room. Arthur's oldest friends, 2 former colleagues from the 7th Circuit, 3 family members who had known Derek since he was in a stroller, and James Whitfield, who had arrived first and taken the chair closest to the fireplace without being directed to it. He was 70 years old, and when I opened the door for him, he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "You're sure about this, Evelyn?" he said, not a question. "I've been sure about this for longer than you'd think," I said. He nodded once and went inside. Peggy stood near the refreshment table with a cup of tea and the expression of a woman who had been briefed and was prepared. The display screen on the east wall reflected the low light of the room, dark and waiting. Derek arrived at 7:22, alone as I had asked. He was wearing the navy jacket Arthur had given him for his 30th birthday, which told me something about the state of his mind, that he had reached for something of his father's on a night like this. His eyes moved around the room, registered the gathering, registered the screen, registered James by the fireplace, and shifted from uncertain to genuinely frightened. "What is this?" he said quietly. "A birthday gathering," I said. "Your father was specific about 35 in the trust documentation." I touched his arm once briefly, the way you touch something you are about to have to let go of, and walked to the center of the room. Arthur wanted Derek's 35th birthday marked as a family occasion, I said. He believed 35 was the age at which a person had made in full the choices that would define the rest of their life. I paused. I think he was right. I nodded at Patricia. The screen came to life. The footage was 41 seconds, captured by the cloud-connected security camera installed 14 months ago at the recommendation of our homeowner's insurance provider. unedited, automatically time-stamped, preserved in its original format, and certified by a digital forensics consultant as court admissible, meaning it could be presented as evidence in any legal proceeding without challenge. Two figures moved through the display room in ambient hallway light. The first opened the cabinet with a key. The second filmed the open cabinet with a phone, the screen glowing with the focused attention of someone documenting an accomplishment. The first figure lifted a piece from the velvet stand and held it up. The second figure laughed, bright and satisfied, captured by the microphone with uncomfortable clarity. Then the second figure said in a voice that needed no introduction, "She'll never know. She's been in Washington for 3 days and she won't be back until Thursday. By the time she lands, this is already done." The first figure turned toward the camera, not knowing it was there, not knowing the footage was uploading in real time to a server in Naperville, and smiled in a way I had never seen on that face before. A smile with no warmth in it. A smile that belonged to a transaction. The screen went dark. The room was so quiet I could hear the fire. Then the front door opened and Chloe walked in. Victoria 2 steps behind. Chloe had dressed with intention, silk blouse hair, smooth makeup applied with the precision of a woman who understood that appearance was a form of argument. She stopped when she saw the screen, stopped when she saw the faces, stopped when she saw the way those faces were looking at her. "That footage has been digitally manipulated," she said, her voice loud and immediate, prepared in the car on the way over. "You can do anything with video now. The footage has been certified as unaltered," Patricia said, rising. "The timestamp is cryptographically embedded. It cannot be modified without breaking the encryption, which would be immediately detectable." She looked at Chloe with the expression she used in depositions, not hostile, simply immovable. "If you have contrary evidence, I'd encourage you to present it." Chloe's hands curled into fists and released and curled again. Her eyes swept the room with the rapid motion of someone looking for an exit that keeps not appearing. James had not moved from his chair. He was looking at Derek, who stood near the entrance with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into something that was not denial, not grief, not anger. Just the hollowed look of a man who had run out of the energy required to feel things in the normal sequence. "Derek," James said. His voice did not need volume. "Your father built that collection over 30 years. He talked about it the way other men talk about their children." He set his glass down with deliberate care. "He told me the reason he put the trust condition in writing was that he hoped you'd never have to find out it existed." James rose slowly from the chair. "He hoped you'd simply be someone who didn't need the warning." The fire popped once in the grate. James picked up his coat, folded it over one arm, and walked toward the hallway without looking at Chloe or Victoria. He paused beside Derek and put one hand on Derek's shoulder, held it there for a single full second, and then he was gone. Patricia opened her laptop. Pursuant to Section 7.4 of the Arthur Montgomery Revocable Trust, established under the Illinois Trust Code 760 ILCS 3. She said in the measured voice she reserved for official statements, "The Trust's forfeiture clause has been triggered by Derek Montgomery's verified participation in the unauthorized removal and transfer of assets belonging to Montgomery Heritage Asset, LLC. The trust corpus of $1 million designated for distribution to Derek Montgomery on the occasion of his 35th birthday has been permanently revoked. This decision was made by me as independent trustee based on documented evidence. It is not subject to appeal." Victoria made a sound like she had been struck. Derek made no sound at all. He sat down, not in a chair. There was no chair near enough onto the bench by the entrance in his father's navy jacket, hands hanging between his knees, eyes on the floor. Chloe crossed the room and bent beside him and said something directly into his ear, her voice too low to carry. Whatever she said made Derek close his eyes. His hands hanging between his knees turned slowly until his palms faced upward, the involuntary gesture of a man who has put down everything he was carrying and has nothing left to hold. I watched my son on that bench in his father's jacket, and I felt the tightening in my chest climb all the way to the back of my eyes. I did not look away. I let it be exactly what it was. The doorbell rang at 8:47 on Sunday morning. I had been awake since 5. The habit had taken hold sometime in the past 2 weeks and showed no sign of releasing me, my body pulling itself out of sleep before the sky had decided what color it wanted to be, leaving me to sit at Arthur's desk in the gray pre-dawn with his letter open in front of me and a cup of coffee I kept forgetting to drink. The house held the particular quiet of a place still processing what it had witnessed the night before, not empty, but braced, the way a room holds its breath after something irrevocable has happened inside it. I set the coffee down and went to the door. Derek stood on the step, alone, no Chloe 2 paces behind him, no defensive posture, no rehearsed expression. His face had come through something and arrived somewhere clarified rather than destroyed, the specific quality of a face that has been through fire and is standing in the ash, still upright, still present. He had shaved. He was wearing a coat I didn't recognize, charcoal gray with a collar he'd turned up against the cold, and I understood immediately that Chloe had not packed for him. He had chosen this coat himself. That small fact landed in my chest with more weight than I expected. He was carrying a single paper coffee cup from the place on Fullerton Avenue he had gone to every Saturday morning since his junior year of college. 21 years of that particular habit, walking to that particular corner, ordering whatever was on seasonal rotation. He had dragged me there once when he was 23, insisting I try their winter blend, and I had stood on that sidewalk in November with a cup between my palms and watched my son talk about the coffee the way his father used to talk about a well-made watch, with the specific delight of a person who has found a small, reliable thing in a world that isn't always either. He held the cup out to me without a word. I took it, stepped back. He came inside. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where I had planned the lunch with Victoria, where I had worked through logistics with Peggy over 3 cups of coffee, where Arthur and I had eaten breakfast for 26 years in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who had long since said everything they needed to say and were content to simply be in the same room. The November light came through the east window, long and flat, lying across the table between us, like something neutral, something that belonged to neither of us and made no judgments. Derek wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at it for a long moment before he spoke. "Chloe isn't going to ask for a divorce," he said. His voice had moved past, broken into something quieter, the voice of a person who has arrived at the chronic stage of something after the acute has passed. The crisis had become the condition. "She told me this morning. She's staying. I handle everything, the restitution, the legal fees, the civil judgment for Garrick, all of it." He paused on the list, each item landing like a stone dropped into still water. "She manages her recovery, her brand, her image." His jaw tightened on the last word. "And I support that process." "And if you don't," I said. "She says she has texts." He turned the cup slowly in his hands the way he used to turn things as a child when he was thinking a rock, a bottle cap, anything small enough to fit in his palm. Things that can be read a certain way if someone wanted to read them that way. The Garrick contact, the authorization letter. She'd put the planning on me. He set the cup down. "I know what you're going to tell me," he said. "That Patricia can demonstrate the chain of responsibility, that Raymond's evidence holds, that her version won't survive what's already documented." He looked up at me directly, and his eyes were steadier than they had been in days, not resolved, not peaceful, but steady, in the way that eyes go steady when a person has finally stopped looking away from something. "You'd be right. Legally, completely right." "But," I said, "but I made choices." His voice cracked once on the word just once, a single fault line opening and then closing and then held. I made them knowing they were wrong, and I made them anyway, because disappointing someone has always been the thing I cannot tolerate. I am 35 years old, and I have never been able to tolerate that. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and held them there. The gesture of a man trying to hold something together from the outside when it is coming apart from the inside. I think I have been confusing love with permission, giving people access to things that weren't mine to give because saying no felt like abandonment. And somehow I made it all the way to 35 before I understood that those are not the same thing. He said it quietly, without drama, the way a person states a fact they wish were not true but has finally finished arguing with. I looked at my son across the kitchen table and felt something shift in my chest, not the tightening I had carried for the past 2 weeks, but something older and deeper than that. The particular ache of watching someone you have loved since before they had words finally arrive at a truth that could have saved them years earlier, and knowing that the arriving is the only part you were ever able to do for them. Then I stood up, went to Arthur's desk in the study, and came back with the folded letter. I sat back down and opened it flat between us, smoothing the creases with both palms, the way I had done 100 times in 4 years, and I read the final paragraph aloud, the one I had never read to anyone before, because until this morning I had not found the person who needed to hear it in the way it was meant to be heard. Evelyn. Arthur had written the ink pressed deeper at the end the way his handwriting always did when he meant something absolutely and wanted to make sure the weight of it survived the page. The measure of a life is not the absence of failure. It is what a person does in the room where the failure lives. Whether they stay in that room and try to make it right or find the nearest exit and call it moving on. The nearest exit is always available. It takes no courage and produces no character. It is simply the nearest exit. I folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment before setting it on the table between us. Derek's eyes had filled slowly, not with the desperate pressurized tears of the past week, but with something quieter and more dignified, the tears of a person who has been handed a truth they recognize at a cellular level and cannot argue with. He breathed through his nose and kept them from falling, and I thought that was all right. Some griefs are held rather than released, and the holding of them is its own form of respect. I don't know how to be different, he said, barely above a breath. You do, I said. You have always known. Knowing and doing are different problems. The first one you solved a long time ago. He looked at me, then down at the letter, then back up. He nodded, not agreement. Not the capitulation he had offered in so many rooms over so many years, but acknowledgement. The specific nod of a person who is marking a truth they are not yet ready to act on, but will no longer pretend they have not heard. He drank the last of his coffee, set the cup down with the careful, deliberate movement of a person placing a period at the end of a very long sentence, a sentence that had taken 35 years to write, and still did not have the ending he would have chosen. Then he stood, buttoned the unfamiliar coat, the one without Chloe's choices in it, the one that was simply his, and I walked him to the front door. The November morning came in cold and quiet smelling of wood smoke and the particular clean sharpness of a city street after a night that dropped below freezing. The oak at the end of the yard stood bare and patient in the gray light. He stepped through the door, stopped on the step, did not turn around. "Will you ever forgive me?" he asked. The question came out small, not manipulative, not calculated, just small, the way honest questions are when they don't know whether they deserve an answer. I held the door open with one hand. "Forgiveness isn't the same as access, sweetheart. I forgave you the moment I understood why you did it. That doesn't mean the door opens from the outside." He stood there for one more breath. Then he said quietly without turning, "I'm sorry, Mom, not for getting caught, for doing it." My chest filled with something I did not have a precise word for. Not forgiveness because I had already given that. Not grief because grief implies an ending, and what I felt was more like a rearrangement, a thing that had been one shape for 35 years, becoming a different shape. The becoming painful in the way all genuine change is painful and necessary in the way all genuine change is necessary. "I know," I said. He walked to the sidewalk, reached the corner of the block, turned left, disappeared behind the hedgerow that the Kowalski family at number 42 had planted 15 years ago and never trimmed to a reasonable height, and which I had complained about every winter since. I closed the door. I stood with my back against it in the quiet of the house, the particular Sunday morning quiet of Lincoln Park in November, full of light and the smell of coffee and Arthur's presence in every worn place in the floor, every book on every shelf, every piece of furniture that still held the specific weight of his preference and his care. I closed my eyes. One tear ran down my left cheek, warm and unhurried. I did not wipe it away. I let it go where it went because some things deserve that much, the uninterrupted completion of themselves. Then from the back of the house through the kitchen and the closed rear door, 3 knocks, light, familiar. The specific unhurried rhythm of someone who has knocked on this door enough times to have developed a signature and knows it will be answered. "Evelyn!" Peggy's voice warm and completely certain of its welcome, with the particular undercurrent of a woman who has been awake since 7:30, waiting for a decent hour to arrive. I've got coffee from the good place and a lemon pound cake from Mariano's, and I have absolutely zero opinions about anything that has happened in the last 10 days. Open up. I open my eyes. Something in my chest, not the tightening, not the grief. Something different and older than either something that had been compressed and waiting loosened. Not all at once, just enough. I pushed off the door. I walked toward the back of the house, toward the light from the kitchen window and the smell of good coffee already coming through the gap at the bottom of the rear door. And somewhere along the hallway I became aware that my face had changed without my permission, that the muscles around my mouth had done something independent of my instruction, outside the jurisdiction of everything I had managed and controlled and held together for the past 2 weeks. I arrived at the back door with the unfamiliar and very welcome sensation of a smile that had come from somewhere real, not performed, not managed, not chosen, just arrived. I put my hand on the latch. I opened the door. People ask me if I regret it, if cutting off your own child feels like justice or like amputation. Honestly, it feels like both. I have carried this family drama for 65 years, the quiet sacrifices, the unequal love, the slow erosion of what I built alongside Arthur. And I have learned the hard way that protecting yourself is not the same as being cold. Sometimes it is the most loving thing left to do. If there is one thing I want you to take from these revenge stories with Mom, and from every story like this one, do not wait. Do not wait until the cabinet is empty, until the trust is broken, beyond repair, until the people you loved most have taken everything and called it family. Set your boundaries before someone else sets them for you. I believe God places certain people in our lives not to stay, but to teach us where our limits are. That lesson cost me a son. I pray it costs you nothing at all. This is family drama at its most painful, not the screaming kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that happens over breakfast tables and birthday gatherings and folded letters from people who saw it coming long before we did. My personal opinion, love without accountability is not love. It is permission. If this story moved something in, you drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories that follow contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and perspective. If that is not what you are looking for today, no judgment. Choose what serves you best.